I was given the impossible task to talk about the future. I think that yesterday was a bit easier looking back. And we know that looking into the future is getting more and more difficult. So I will try to combine a few things, show a few slides on things that I see happening in the healthcare environment, then show you a few slides on the restructuring that is currently going on in Karolinska, and then take a bit of a leap to have a view on how I think a few things will develop, if that's okay. So the first slide, I think that these really are topics that I think about on a daily basis, try to work with. And I will start on the opposite side compared to the talks yesterday, where we started at basic science and then looking at genetics, genomics, proteomics, and how to bring that to the clinical arena. And I will start at the patient side. So how do I see the behavior of patients changing? And what is the impact of that on our healthcare delivery models and what we're currently doing? So patient connectivity is extremely important at this point in time. We need to rethink our health delivery models. Last week, I had a meeting with the 10 CEOs of the largest university hospitals in Europe. And we all face exactly the same question. How can we restructure our delivery models in order to create a sustainable healthcare system? Because we are all aware of the fact that the old system is not functional again. It's not functional anymore, and it won't bring us in the next phase. And the third one is about big data and artificial intelligence. It's just entering the clinical arena. And the big question is, how can we work with it? How can we make it really of value for our patients? If you look at big data, if you look at analysis that we do, computational activities, and you translate that to the clinical arena, there's such a big gap to what doctors and nurses do on a day-to-day basis compared with what we talked about yesterday. So to start off with, I think that there is a very big movement going on in the world that empower patients. Sweden is not at the forefront of this move. We don't go rapidly enough in empowering patients. Medical records are being opened for patients so that all patients have accessibility to their patient journals. I started doing this about 6 years ago when I was the CEO of Radboud University Hospital, and I had a phone call of the health minister within 2 hours and questions in the House of Parliament the next day. Was it really a sensible thing to do? And now it's in one of the letters of the ministry to open up patient journals in the Netherlands completely. We are doing it in Sweden as well. The Stockholm region is not at the forefront, but we are opening up journals. And I think that the next step will be that it's not only opening up journals so that our patients see the data, but also enter the data in their journals, which will be a very big step. An important step because we have to change the data into true information which can help them to govern their own diseases. So opening up patient journals, a very important step. We have to continue doing so. In 2015, the patient journals that were opened in the US were more accessed by patients than by care providers. And that really shows that this is a very big change that we're facing. The second one is, those of you who use the T-Bahn in Stockholm have seen this ad a couple of times. This is also a development. Patients do not want to wait to have an appointment with a hospital, with a care provider, with primary care. They want to have instant access. They don't need to have a face-to-face contact. They want to have a link to doctors or nurses. They want to have an instant answer on their question or get a prescription and go to the pharmacy and get the drugs. This is a movement that is increasingly seen in the Western world. So we have to see how we can cope with that. A third one is, and you probably have seen this, patients know best. It's initiated by the guy that's on the photo, Mohammed, a couple of years ago, and this is a very big movement in the UK. Again, it really shows that patients are being empowered. They have control on their medical records, and they can help institutions, doctors and nurses to see how they can provide the best healthcare. Another example, Walter de Brouwer. I met him a couple of years ago when he was just working at Silicon Valley. He's an old Cambridge professor, and he got extremely frustrated by the healthcare system caused by one of the accidents of his son. He hacked the health journal of his son when he was admitted in the hospital. And what he noticed is that what was written down in the electronic medical record was different from what the doctors and nurses told him. He left the UK and went to Silicon Valley and started working on equipment that could really diagnose diseases within the home environment. So taking away the responsibility of diagnostic from a hospital or care provider to the home environment. This is just the beginning. And this is FDA approved. You can have an EKG, blood pressure, respiratory rate, core temperature, heart rate, etc. measure in an instant. We now know that this is being done with a lot of sensors, and that's related also to my statement about opening up patient journals. So these data are going to be entering patient journals within the next couple of years. Very interesting development, and I think a very important development. Another thing is interesting in research. More and more we see that people go out crowdsourcing to get money to start their own research. So they don't wait for researchers to come up with a specific topic that they want to investigate, but they start initiating themselves. You see that in patient groups with chronic diseases. And this is an example of a person who started setting up research, looking at the long-term effect of antidepressant drugs in the US. So this is also a new development completely out of the grant arena that we are so familiar with, or the arena that has been subsidized by local or governmental authorities. So these are a few things that I see happening that will really empower patients, help them govern their own disease, but also set the agenda much more in the future than they have done before. So what about healthcare delivery systems and healthcare delivery models? I think that we are facing within the healthcare environment a few basic problems. We have become extremely specialized, highly successful, I might say, because if you look at the treatment options that we have compared to 30 years ago, we have many more treatment options. But at the same time, we have become extremely fragmented. We are siloed within a hospital like the Karolinska University Hospital, but we're also siloed if you look at the total system. A university hospital versus a non-university hospital, primary care, psychiatry, and what you have. So fragmentation is one of the big problems that we are currently facing within the healthcare systems in the Western world. The second one is related to the big variance in quality and practice variance. And I think that the one is correlated to the other. So fragmentation and quality variation is, in my mind, related to each other. This is an example of a variation in practice in different diseases. This is a log scale. So the differences, the variations is even much more bigger than you would expect. So if you look at hip fractures, the practice variation is relatively low. That's what you expect because it's very well protocolized. But if you look at, for instance, back surgery, you see that the variation increases enormously. And if you look at radical prostatectomy, it's even higher. You would not expect such a large variation in treatment options, where the treatment and diagnostic tools are so protocolized. So variation in practice is really a big issue in the Western world. This is another example. This is an example of the SLL environment. This is the variation in stroke care, and it's case mix adjusted. This is the deviation in days cared for, and this is the deviations in patients with a good activity level. What you can see in Sweden is that the variation, these are the different regions, that the variation is quite big. So these are doing well, above the 1.0 line. But if you look at the number of care days, of days that they are hospitalized in this variance, you see there's a very huge variance. So there's a variance in quality and there's a variance in costs. Again, we know what the best treatment is, and we know what the best protocol are. So fragmentation is one thing, practice variation and quality variation is another thing. And the third one is related to the increase in costs. And we know that there's a lot of debate about increasing costs, and you can talk about it in terms of is it enough that we get in healthcare, or should it be decreased? Should you govern it from the GDP level, or should you govern it from the patient needs? I think one thing is very clear. If you look at the curves from about 1970 up to 2015, there is definitely a large increase. And if you try to translate that to added years in life or quality in life, you can ask yourself whether it was well invested. So I think that's also a thing that we need to take into account a lot. If you look at the healthcare system as such, this is one of the reasons why we feel a pressure on the healthcare system on a daily basis. If you go out and talk to the people within the Karolinska, and you ask the question, do you think that you have the resources in order to provide the care that you want to provide? The answer is no. Although we spend more money than ever before. So there's something in the way we have organized ourselves within the healthcare system. And this is one of the reasons, I think. This is our old organizational structure. A typical division structure with multiple departments or multiple clinics. And if you look at the list of these clinics, the arrangement doesn't make sense. Give you an example. This is the Hudson division, head division. You have geriatrics, hearing balance, logopedy, neurophysiology, psychology, neuroradiology, barn radiology, acute radiology, and ENT. So just a mix of clinics that don't have any relationship in common other than that they are governed by production and by money in the system. So it doesn't help to increase the collaboration between the clinics. It doesn't help to really look at the flow of the patients through the healthcare system. So this is one of the reasons that we're now currently in Karolinska restructuring very fundamentally and go back to one of the principles is that when we want to add value for our patients, want to increase the quality, want to decrease the practice variation, and we have a better view on the costs, then we need to work in a multi-professional team. And this is a typical multi-professional team. We call it the oval table, where we have a new first line responsible person, the patient flow captain. We have a patient representative at the table. Extremely important, very early in the process, to have patients at the table to redesign your patient flow. You can learn so much from patients if you look at the way you've designed your processes within the hospital. You need the people from the education and the research side at the table, the different physicians, administrative support, and business developments, for instance. So this is the typical setup we have arranged for all our patients' flow within the Karolinska University Hospital at this point in time. We are now in implementing this new organizational model. And this is an example of the heart and vascular theme. And they've come so far that for every flow, for every patient flow, for every patient group, they can follow it on a daily basis using 9 digital scoring cards. So they know where the patients are, they know what to aim for quality-wise, and they know what kind of process they have designed. And this is what we're going to do for all patient flows or combined patient flow within the Karolinska University environment. And this is a very big change because it's overriding the clinics. Give you an example. If you look at the old way of structure, a patient with colorectal cancer would go to the Department of Gastroenterology. You might have gastroenterologists and surgeons working there. Then that patient might go to the Department of Radiotherapy. Then that patient might go to the oncologist and then back again to the gastroenterologist. In our new design, the patient will remain in the same flow. And there's a seamless follow-up of the patients. And looking at the digital scoring cards, you can follow up the patient through the treatment period and follow them in the next couple of years. If you then add up the different pathways of the patients, you get to a patient area. And if you have the different patient areas, they will form a theme. So that's the current structure we are implementing within the university hospital. And then we have functions, perioperative function, radiology and imaging, the lab, emergency medicine, and health professionals. This is a design that we designed ourselves within the university hospital. If I talk to my colleagues in different hospitals, there are a few different models that you can apply. One of the other models that is being implemented in many hospitals at the moment are integrated practice units. For instance, the Cleveland Clinic and the Mayo Clinic are very busy in implementing that. They don't have then perioperative medicine, but parts of perioperative medicine are within the theme of children and women, or within the theme of heart and vascular. The reason for us not doing so is that if you look at the investments in people and in equipment in these functions, it is so huge that we need to maximize the utilization in order to make it work. So you need a very large hospital, although the Karolinska University Hospital is quite a large hospital, but you need even a larger hospital to optimize your integrated practice unit. So that's the reason why we have this matrix structure. So currently we have about 50% live, and in the next step, before the end of this year, 100% of the organization is functioning in this structure. On another note, maybe many of you have read the work of Clayton Christensen. It's also related to the big change that we're currently having within our healthcare system. Clayton Christensen describes 3 business models within the healthcare system. One business model is a solution shop, the other business model is a production shop, and the third one is a network. If you translate that to the work that we do, a typical example of a solution shop is where Anna Vanel talked about yesterday. Rare diseases are really diagnosed and treated in a solution shop. You need many professionals around the table with a high expertise in certain topics in order to figure out what the diagnosis is and whether there is a treatment and how to treat that patient. Cancer, it's the same. But for heart and vascular diseases, for instance, where you have a low variance of diagnosis and a very straight production line, it's more of a production factory. You know what to do when you have heart disease. There are 3 or 4 diagnostic tools that you need to have, and then you start operating or another intervention. And then the third one is a network construction, and that's for chronic diseases. So it makes a lot of sense what we're currently doing within the Stockholm environment, and that's that we don't any longer see our chronic patients necessarily within the hospital vicinity, but we're building up academic spec centers, new platforms for treatment of chronic diseases, where we have a lot of similarities between the different chronic diseases that we treat. For instance, diabetes, MS, arthritis. And try to do that outside the hospital environment, but connect to the hospital environment when needed. So in our case, we are moving out. We see about 1.7 million patients on a yearly basis, and we are moving out to 280,000 patients, outpatients, within the next 2 years. For instance, by moving them to other hospitals, because they don't need a high-end hospital like a university hospital, or by building up this new academic spec centers for the treatment of chronic diseases. Very interesting development, and also a development that you see in the rest of the Western world. So this is, in my mind, the way to go. The only thing that we have to figure out is how to do it in a smart way. We have to rebuild, or not rebuild, but we have to invent new platforms for treating of chronic patients. So not multiplying the old hospital thought that we have, but really reinventing a new way, or inventing a new way of treating them. Then one last bit, a little bit about big data and artificial intelligence. If you look at the clinical research that we do at the Karolinska University Hospital, and we follow that up, of course, on a yearly basis, it's going relatively well. The crown factor, which we think is the most important one, we are at the level of 1.95 at the moment, which is number 2 in Europe. Interestingly enough, this is for clinical research. If you look at basic research, it's the same level. Quite often people think that clinical research is at a lower citation index compared to basic research. In our environment, that's not the case. So we have a lot of things to be proud of. At the same time, the question, I think, is really on the table now. are we doing research in the areas where it's really needed? So do we do research in areas where the disease burden is very large, the costs are very large, and we need new solutions for the future? So one of the exercises that we're currently doing together with Jan Andersson at the SLL level is to try to make sense of this. So what we started off doing, and one of the big advantages of the Swedish system is that you have an enormous amount of data. You can follow patients for a very long period. So within the SLL environment, we have all the data of the patients that are cared for in SLL. So we can look at the burden of disease. We can look at the costs. We can look at the potential improvement. We can learn things from, for instance, 4D project, a project that has run for a couple of years within Stockholm, looking at the improvement of arthritis, diabetes, and breast cancer. And we selected a few areas where we did deep dives in to see how much the disease burden is, what are the connected costs, and how much are we investing in research. We'll show you one of two slides on this. Again, it's an exercise to gain more insight on what we are investing and what we are getting back from these investments. This slide shows you, for instance, that in breast cancer, the disease burden is quite high, and we are also doing high-end research. The same applies for diabetes. But if you look, for instance, at HIV or neural tube defects, we do a lot of good research, but we don't have that many patients. If you look at back pain and neck pain, the disease burden is very high, but we don't do any research, or not a very large volume of research. So it helps us to rethink where we want to place our money and what we want to develop. And it might be very good that we're doing a lot of good HIV research, not for the Stockholm facility, but mainly for Africa. But these areas also need to be thought of. So it helps us to get more information to see what really makes sense for future steps in taking healthcare to the next level. Yesterday we talked a lot about computational power, which we need in the environment of proteomics and genetics. It's interesting that it's not used to a very large extent to make decisions or to design decision support for our doctors and our nurses. And to give you an example, if you look at PubMed and you look for new treatment options in prostate cancer, there were more than 5,000 publications in 2016. So how can you expect a doctor or a nurse or an institute to really comprehend all the information that's in these 5,000 articles? So that's really the next step that I see happening. And you see that already in some of the large cancer centers in the US, that artificial intelligence is used as a decision tool for doctors and nurses in order to choose the treatment for patients. If I look at that development within our environment, we have decision support when we select drugs, but that's about it. Not for broader treatment, for broader diseases. So if you take the combination, for instance, what is possible with SciLife Lab to genotype tumors and genotype patients, bring that to the clinical arena, have decision support for our doctors and nurses in order to select the right drugs for our patients, then we can really make a big step. So to conclude, I think that patient connectivity is extremely important to really find out what our patients need from us and to do that in a completely new way. It will also decrease the burden a lot within the healthcare system when patients take a more active role and a more active stand. The second part is that if you look at our healthcare delivery model, it is outdated, so we need to restructure. That's not easy. If you read Svenska Dagbladet of Dags Nyheter, you can follow that. But it's necessary. It is necessary. So we have to take these steps in order to organize ourselves around the patient journey within the healthcare system. And the third one is we need to get a better grip on our data that we have and see that we can change our data into true information to help us guide to make the right decision where to put our money for clinical research, but also to have decision support for our doctors and nurses. Thank you.
Thank you, Melvin, for a very Interesting presentation and illuminating for me, for sure. We have time for questions.
What do the doctors think? Okay. What are the view of this major change? I mean, where there are no clinics any longer, there are more systems and things like that. What is the view of the personnel in the hospital? For example, the doctors.
Yeah, I think that the opinion of the personnel is quite different from the areas. If you look at the change that we're currently making, the phase 1 people, heart and vascular, for instance, they had a very difficult time about a year ago. And if you see where they are now, it's going really good. So it is difficult. Mainly for doctors, it is difficult to make this change. One of the reasons is that the development of a medical specialty, of the organization of a medical specialty, has been a synonym for the clinic. So what we're actually doing is that we are breaking this relationship, that you have the organizational structure and you have to remain an organization so that the doctors as professionals can develop in the future and can also secure education. That's the main topic that we're talking about, and see how we can implement that. Again, to the example of heart and vascular, it's not that much of a problem because they have been working in their environment. Neurology, neuro is the same. For oncology and trauma and reparative medicine, the discussion is a bit different. So we have to find ways to secure the constant development of the medical profession. And at the same time, we have to tell the organization so that we can follow the patient through the flows, through their journey. That's also one of the reasons that we didn't create a blueprint. And we didn't see that this as a project that's just being rolled out in the organization, but that we're constantly adapting the organizational structure to the needs of the patients, but also to the needs of the doctors or the nurses. To give you an example, in building the patient flows for heart diseases, it's quite straightforward in oncology. For rare diseases, it's quite different. So we might end up with a different solution in rare diseases.
Matthias?
Is this on? Yeah, okay. So a very nice presentation. And I must say, I would love the journalists to focus a little bit more on the transformation of healthcare instead of the buildings. Yeah, but let's not talk about that. One thing that I really find interesting is the difference in healthcare cost in the United States and Europe. In the United States, the GDP, the healthcare is almost 17 and is probably going up to 20% of GDP. In Europe, in Scandinavia, it's about 10%. And in Asia, it's usually around 2-3%, but probably that's not so interesting. But the difference between the United States and Europe is so enormous. So can you sort of comment on that? And are the healthcare twice as good in the United States?
The last part of the question is easy to answer. The answer is no. The healthcare in the US is not much better than the healthcare in Europe. And especially if you compare the healthcare in the US to Sweden. Sweden is doing a really good job. Before I answer your question, or try to answer your question, because it's very difficult to answer that question, there's one other thing that is very interesting. We didn't talk about that because I had a lack of time, is how do we look about keeping our people healthy? And you touched upon it yesterday briefly. If you look at the development of obesity in the US, and that's being mapped for the last 30 years. So what we do, or what the US has done, they waited for 30 years to see what happens. And then they started operating these patients and giving them drugs because they have type 2 diabetes. So there is something in the healthcare system that waits until a person is really a patient and then start treating them. So that's a big problem, and certainly in the US, and it's a bit of a less of a problem in Europe and in Sweden. What is different in the US is that healthcare is really a consumer market. So people consume a lot of healthcare, which is not the case in Sweden because it's more restricted. And what we can see now is that a consumer market drives a lot of volume increase and a lot of cost increase. I think that's typically one of the advantages of the Swedish system, that it can be more contained. Although the disadvantage of the Swedish system is that we are not listening enough to our patients because we know what's best. So these are very big differences. You mentioned Asia. I think that if you look at the healthcare system in Singapore, and our colleague just left, but if you look at the setup of the healthcare system in Singapore and also at the costs, you can also learn a lot because the costs in the Singapore system are much lower than in our system. They have the advantage that they invented or they built their healthcare system much later than we did. And that's one of the struggles, of course, what we currently have, also related to your question, how do you restructure the healthcare system, that we have an enormous legacy built up over the last 4 decades that makes it very difficult to make a large change. And I think the resistance in the healthcare system as such, I'm not talking about Karolinska, has also a reason, because we have been able to build up a very high quality. But we also need to see that if we want to make the next step, the change has to be quite radical.
One more last question, yeah.
Melvin, how do you pick the leadership in that new thematic organization? Do you base it on the persons who has written the highest impact factor journal, or do you base it on people who comes more from an industrialized world, who knows about flow, organization, responsibilities?
Actually, it's a combination of that. I'm convinced that leaders in a healthcare environment should have knowledge about the healthcare environment. So the leaders that we choose in Karolinska do have a background in healthcare and mainly in a university hospital environment. About 70% of the new leaders that we have pinpointed now have been working at Karolinska, have a large tradition. About 30-40% comes from outside. What is interesting is that if you look at the themes, our themes are about the size of 2,000 to 2,500 people. It's a relatively large business. So if you ask a doctor to run such a large business, that person needs support of people that have run businesses. So we now have operative chefs in every theme and every function. Most of the operative chefs, it's a COO, comes from outside the hospital environment, and these persons bring in a lot of expertise to run a large company like this. It is surprising that that was not the case in Sweden, because I've been working with COOs in divisions for the last 20 years. If you go to the Mayo Clinic or go to the Cleveland Clinic, they have these persons who can really help the leaders of a theme or a function in order to take the next step.
How do you see the development of responsibility towards the patient? In your organization, it's much more of a team effort. Mm-hmm. Are we going to keep a single doctor to be responsible, or is it the responsibility of the team?
That is a very difficult issue to resolve. I think that if you talk to patient groups, they prefer to have one doctor. At the same time, we know that it is a team effort. We have been trying to come up with solutions that I think do not work entirely by installing coordinators. That's not a solution. I think it has to be very clear for a patient who is the responsible doctor at any point in time, but at the same time know that it is a team effort. And I will give you one example. One of the we've had the Macchiarini case at Karolinska. In Radboud, we had the heart and vascular case. And the heart and vascular heart surgery department was closed down by the health inspectorate because of bad quality. And we started restructuring that. I came in as a person responsible for quality and patient safety. We started restructuring that. Do you know how many people we had to replace in order to get to the level of the number 3 in Europe?
10.
2. The head of the department of cardiac surgery and a cardiologist. That was all. So the expertise in the team is most of the time there. It's much more in the collaboration nowadays than ever before. If we can design a very good collaboration, and Anna, you gave a very good example in that. If you design a very good collaboration, then the quality increases and the costs decrease, actually. And what we're actually doing in our new organizational model is that we are adjusting our organizational structure to the way of working that teams have been done for the last couple of years that have been excelling.
I just want to point out that there will be a little panel discussion afterwards. So if you have more questions for Melvin, then we can do that later. So I think we should thank Melvin again for a very nice presentation.
Well, it's a pleasure to be here and to give you my vision of how I think medicine is going to change in the future. I think the big question is how long what I'm talking about is going to take. But I think in some places it will go quite quickly. And the real point is, I think there's a tipping point centered about something I call P4 medicine, predictive, preventive, personalized, and participatory, that is driven by systems thinking, systems medicine, by big data, and by something we call scientific wellness. And to put all of that in perspective, I think in the United States, we've had one incredibly big tipping point or paradigm shift in medicine that happened about 1910 when the Carnegie Institute created a report called the Flexner Report that looked at the 165 medical schools that existed in the States, all of them, with a few exceptions, trade schools with no science, no education, no nothing. And that report basically said, look, one has to introduce science both to clinical care and science into the education of medical students. And the 165 medical schools in a period of 10 years went to 35. So it was a striking getting rid of the inadequate. And a few schools like Hopkins embraced this fully and took off and attained the leadership position they still have. So being at the leading edge of tipping points has enormous advantages. I would say that we are in a position now for a second big tipping point, and that's going to be the topic of the entire lecture that I'll give to you today. And what I'd like to do is give you my approach to thinking about medicine and healthcare over the last 45 years or so. I went to Caltech as a young assistant professor in 1970 and was really challenged by the complexity both of biology and of medicine, studying disease and so forth. And what was absolutely clear at the time is, one, we had no conceptual means for discussing biological complexity. That later came to be systems biology. And number two, we didn't begin to have tools that were adequate to the task of being able to deal with complexity. And one way to deal with it is to make lots of measurements that have been carefully selected. And I remember reading in 1973 this book by Thomas Kuhn, and it was basically about paradigm changes in physics. And he made two really simple points that stayed with me. One is to imagine a paradigm change is really challenging because it requires thinking outside the box, and we don't educate our students to think outside the box. Very few people do that naturally. And number two, he said, even if you could provide a proof of principle for the paradigm change, it's very hard to get it achieved because scientists are fundamentally incredibly conservative and very reluctant to give up their long-held beliefs. And with that in mind, I, over the next 45 years or so, have participated in a series of paradigm changes that all deal with this complexity. And I tell you about all of them because they lie at the heart of understanding what P4 medicine is all about. So the first of the changes was bringing engineering to biology. And over the years, we've developed 6 instruments, basically, that allow you to read and write DNA. And a really important point I've always believed is when scientists produce something useful, they should make it available to society. So we actually created 3 companies that enabled these 6 instruments to become commercialized and hence available to the biological community. And I'll say the first 2 of these companies, Applied Biosystems and Rosetta, contributed enormous cash resources back to the science we do. So it's not only beneficial for society, it's beneficial for the science if you do it right as well. Now, one of these instruments, the automated DNA sequencer, led to the second paradigm change, and that's the Human Genome Project. So in the spring of '85, I got invited to the first meeting ever held on the Human Genome Project. 12 of us invited to pass judgment on it to Santa Cruz. And 2 interesting results came out. One, we all agreed that it was feasible, although technically really challenging at that time. And 2, we were split 6-6 on whether it was a good idea. And those against it were really against it because of their passionate hatred and misunderstanding of big science and what it does. The feeling was big science would swallow small science and it would be forever lost. Going out into the community, I would say in the early years, 86, 87, 88, probably 80% of the biologists were utterly opposed to the Human Genome Project for similar kinds of reasons. And I'll tell you who was most opposed was the National Institutes of Health. And it remained bitterly opposed right up until a National Academy of Science committee endorsed the project, and they flipped around and made major contributions. So it was driven by the Department of Energy, the creation of the Human Genome Project, and not at all by NIH. But what it did was it gave us, on the one hand, a complete parts list. So for the first time, we could think about systems experiments in human biology. And we'll talk about a whole variety of those a little later on. And number 2, the Human Genome Project gave us the ability to correlate human variability with human phenotype. And that is an enormous advancement. The automated DNA sequencer required chemistry, physics, engineering, and computer science to really end up achieving. And what I realized from that was that biology departments should be embedded in cross-disciplinary departments so that leading-edge biology could drive the technologies relevant to searching appropriate patient data space. And those technologies had access to the analytic tools to be able to handle the data. So biology driving technology, driving computation. And if you put those together, you could create entirely new concepts in biology. You could generate enormous intellectual property and the like. I tried to do that at Caltech. The biologists vetoed it completely. And it was basically insecurity. So Bill Gates made it possible to go to the University of Washington and set up the first such department. And in 8 years, we pioneered the first 2 techniques of the then newly emerging field of proteomics, Rudy Abersol and John Yates. Number 2, Phil Green wrote the 2 critical pieces of software for the Human Genome Project for assembly and quality control. Number 3, Geir Vandening developed an incredible multi-parameter high-speed cell sorter. And 4, we developed the inkjet technology that was eventually commercialized by Agilent to create very, very high rates of DNA synthesis and DNA array chip production. Serendipity is really interesting. The dean that hired me to the University of Washington had promised the floor of a building 4 years afterwards when I got the cross-disciplinary department set up to build systems biology. And just a year before, he unfortunately died in an avalanche in the Himalayas, and the new dean came in with a completely new spectrum of objectives and goals. So I then resigned in 2000 from the university to set up the Independent Institute of Systems Biology, the first such in the world. And it immediately started focusing on both biology, but especially on disease. And it led to the formulation of the two concepts that are really central to what we're going to be talking about in this lecture, systems medicine and the P4 medicine, P4 healthcare that I talked about earlier. In about 2012 or 13, my question was how I could bring P4 medicine to the healthcare system. And what we decided to do in 2014 was set up a 108-person experiment for a period of a year using dense, dynamic, personalized data clouds to study scientific wellness. And I'll tell you all about what we found in that regard. Following that, we set up a company called Aerofail that actually commercializes the ability to bring scientific wellness to the ordinary consumer and so forth. And the last paradigm change was in April of last year when our institute agreed to become the research arm of Providence Health Systems, a local community hospital system. And I became actually the chief science officer of that system. And for the first time, we had the ability to directly bring P4 to patients. And at the end of the lecture, we'll talk about the many things that we're doing in that regard. Now, from these series of paradigm changes, I'd say we learned two really important things. One, it's really true there was enormous skepticism for every one of these changes. Smart people can think of 100 reasons why something is not going to work, and often they get paralyzed that way. But I think even more important is this idea that almost never can new organizational structures emerge from old organizations because the bureaucracies have been honed by the past and they struggle to maintain the present. Thinking about the future is impossible. So for paradigm changes, an institution such as the Karolinska has to think about how you can affect these kind of changes I'm going to be talking about, because you'll have large numbers of your physicians utterly opposed to the kinds of ideas that they actually represent. So just a quick word about the Institute. We've kept it very small, very flat administrative organization, so we can make incredibly large decisions extremely quickly, and it has worked absolutely beautifully. I think large organizations really have to think about how to deal with novelty and innovation and creativity on a broader sense than just that comes from the individuals that participate in it. And I think part of why we've been successful is this integrated view of how we think about systems biology. One, we've really studied how to bring an integrated systems approach both to biology and disease. Two, we've realized that the development of technologies, systems-driven, is really key. Three, the analytic tools are absolutely essential. Four, creating this cross-disciplinary environment where biology drives technology, drives analytics, and comes back to change biology is absolutely critical. Five, the idea of big science, that is a science which is systems-driven, which is integrative, which is cross-disciplinary, and milestone-driven, is utterly essential for solving most big problems. Single labs cannot do that. And the big science, small science have enormous synergies, and we can talk about that if we need to later. To create these effective big science partnerships, you need to think about strategic partners and select very carefully. And of course, what is great about our current communication system is they democratize the world with regard to recruiting talent. You can go get the best in the world to do whatever you need to do. And finally, a big point that we've always made is we have a real responsibility to transfer knowledge to society, and we've done so in two major ways. One, for example, ISB has started 8 companies in the 17 years of our existence. They've returned around $10 million already back to our science, and they offer an enormous opportunity for translating our knowledge out into society. And number two, we've done a lot of things with K through 12 education, and something we won't have time to talk about now. So systems biology has really profoundly changed how we think about approaching problems in medicine, attacking problems in disease. And let me tell you about three of the four major types of change. Any complex biological problem, I believe, requires the generation of enormous sets of data to test all of its dimensionalities with regard to both environmental and genetic constraints on the living organism. And these dense dynamic personal data clouds with literally billions of data points give us the ability to analyze and integrate these data so it leads to actionable possibilities for the individual patient. Possibilities that let you improve wellness and avoid or ameliorate disease. And we'll give you examples of those later. But equally important, these dense dynamic personalized data clouds let you study disease every bit as well as they let you study wellness. And it is the essence of what precision medicine should be, and it isn't. Precision medicine in almost all countries is so biased toward one-dimensional genomics that it is really appalling from my point of view. Number two, systems biology has let us think in important ways about the role integrated networks play within living organisms. These integrated networks are the informational byways that govern development, physiology, aging, and when a critical network becomes disease-perturbed, causes disease. And if you can distinguish normal and disease-perturbed networks from one another, you gain fundamental insights into disease mechanisms and new approaches to both the creation of biomarkers and drug target candidates. And we'll give you a few examples of that kind of thing. The third thing that systems biology approaches brings is very powerful technologies and very powerful systems-driven strategies. And these are just some of the technologies that we've been engaged with, and I'll talk about the one that I think is going to have the two there that are going to have the biggest impacts in just a second. Strategies are putting together technologies with platforms that allow you to analyze the data and so forth. And again, these each open up an enormous array of possibilities in both understanding disease and thinking about entirely new ways of doing clinical trials. So one technology that I think is going to be fantastic, and frankly, forget about Illumina and all the other competitors out there, it's third-generation DNA sequencing, single molecule, nanopore detection, electronic detection. And I've seen a device recently that I think, number one, is easily going to be able to do 500,000 base pair reads accurately. I think, number two, is going to be able to read each of the 16 epigenetic marks on DNA as you sequence it. I think, number three, it's going to be able to sequence RNA every bit as easily as DNA. And if we can figure out one or two major technical problems, we'll be able to sequence proteins every bit as easily as we can sequence nucleic acids. And of course, the advantage of that is you immediately can assess RNA editing, RNA splicing, protein chemical modifications, and the like. So, and I think the final thing is, I think you can parallelize this to where we can do a whole human genome in less than 15 minutes. And the cost, I predict in 10 years, will be well under $100 per genome. So it makes it a routine kind of clinical test. Another area, together with Jim Heath at Caltech, who really pioneered this technique, he's using circular 5-mer deamino acid peptides that can be linked together really cleverly with a chemistry called click chemistry to create dimer or trimer protein capture agents that have really unusual properties. One, they're rock stable. You could put them in an envelope, send them to Africa, the affinity wouldn't change at all. Number two, they're digital in the sense, once you know the two monomers and the nature of the linking chemistry, you can do everything in vitro with copper catalysis. It means you're freed from the tyranny of mice or animals or cells. Really an important point. And number three, which I think is most important, we've now devised really clever techniques whereby we can create these protein capture agents and minimize any kind of cross-reactivity. And that's essential for in vivo and vitro diagnostics and really complex mixtures and so forth. And finally, these reagents are going to be spectacular drugs, and we've already shown that in 2 cases. I think these reagents will totally replace monoclonal antibodies within a 10 to 15-year period. And then the final point I'd make is Mike Tyers at the University of Montreal has come up with beautiful synthetic biology methods for being able to synthesize 16,000 metabolic enzymes from microbes, put them into cassettes that you can put into back vectors for yeast in combinations of 4, 5, 6, or 7, so you can synthesize natural synthetic products. And in principle, you could create 1 billion drugs in an incredibly short period of time, and you can use the very high throughput yeast screening methods to screen them for a fraction of what it costs to screen ordinary drugs. And in the future, with problems like drug resistance, what we'll do is not worry about mechanisms ever. We'll just very quickly create a drug that can deal with the resistance within a week of the time that one sees it. And that's, I think, one of the futures that we can think about. So those are the technologies and strategies that are really going to revolutionize biology. We don't have time to talk about any more of those. The convergence then of systems medicine, of digital measurements, of big data, and of connectivity, which was mentioned by the previous speaker, I think is absolutely critical. And it allowed us to hone our concepts of what P4 medicine should be in incredible ways. So how does it differ from contemporary medicine? 1, it's proactive. Number 2, it's focused on the individual and not on populations. Number 3, it is concerned with wellness as well as disease and not just with disease. Number 4, it employs these dense dynamic personal data clouds to assess the contributions of genetics and environment for individual health. And finally, and most important, number 5, it says the way we're doing clinical trials now is absolutely tragically flawed, where you take 20,000 patients and you give them a cancer drug or a placebo, you extract the data, then you ask yourself the question, are each of these individuals unique genetically and environmentally? And the answer is yes. And we know if you average disparate objects, you increase the noise over signal enormously. So what P4 medicine would do is have 20,000 individuals, each with their unique data cloud, and then you could probe that population with the kinds of questions you're interested in. For example, which of these individuals respond effectively to drug A? Once you did that, you'd know exactly what the unique characteristics are that allow that response to drug A. And just to drive this point home, these are the 10 top-selling drugs in the US today. And the orange person is the responder, the blue are the non-responders. So you have a 1 in 4 to a 1 in 25 ratio of non-response. Imagine all the money that's wasted all the morbidity that's created by many of these different drugs. And when you do the analyses in the old-fashioned pooled population way, you have no idea how to distinguish the responder from the non-responder. If you do it with the P4 approach, you'll immediately have features that can create biomarkers that can differentiate. So that shows you the power of one thing it can do. So the two major themes then here are wellness and disease. And I think there's going to emerge to be a wellness industry that is really striking in the future. These dense dynamic data clouds can do four important things. One, they allow you to optimize wellness. Two, they allow you to follow disease, response to therapy, and all the way through to the end of its course. And three, they allow you to follow transitions from wellness to disease to get biomarkers for the earliest stage that let you then identify the drugs or appropriate therapeutic approaches to reverse the disease at the earliest stage before it manifests itself as phenotype. And I'll just say, N-of-1 experiments in the future are going to be the rule for deconvoluting lots of complexity. And a number of new pharma now are thinking of N of a small number of kind of experiments in the future. So we started the 100 Pioneer Project then in 2014. And it's really an important project because 60% of the determinants of health come from environment, lifestyle, and 30% from genetics, and the dense dynamic data clouds let you assess both of those different types of things. We do the genome sequence in this first study every 3 months, blood, urine, saliva, to get the proteins, clinical chemistry, and metabolites. We do the gut microbiome every 3 months, and we do digital measurements of tracking sleep and activity and things like that, generating for each a data cloud of billions of data points that can be analyzed for each to identify these actionable possibilities, which are delivered on a monthly basis to the individuals by coaches that have both psychological experience in persuading people to change their behavior and the ability to explain what the actionable possibilities are. The coaches gave us a 70% compliance and actionable possibilities with study, which is absolutely spectacular. And they're the key to us getting long-term retention of individuals. So we'll have very good longitudinal data. So the data that we generated fell into three really interesting categories. Correlations that gave us completely new insights in how you go about identifying drug targets. The ability to do genetic risk for 60 different diseases on each of the individuals, which open up all sorts of possibilities we haven't time to talk about. And finally, state transitions, wellness to disease, and vice versa. So I had a friend that had a disease transition at 35, a long history of cardiovascular disease. All his forefathers had died before 50 at heart attacks and so forth. He noted his cholesterol with no change in anything zoomed up, as did his weight. And he took care of both of those, and he's roughly 65 and in good shape now. And the dense dynamic personal data clouds are going to give us the ability to see the transitions. And one transition we've recently noted was an individual that was diagnosed in January of 17 with pancreatic cancer, where we had blood samples a year and a half before. We analyzed all of the proteins, and here's the spectrum of proteins from almost 1,000 patients. And this patient had a protein out at that stage, which was a not signaling pathway specific for beta cells. And what's interesting is, if this is really a good marker, we could use immunotherapy at the earliest stage to reverse this thing. And again, if the disease comes out even further, we may be able to find this marker and again, do that kind of reversal. And let me tell you, we've looked at the other blood samples and we see samples going out even further this direction. So it is a possibility for a biomarker. So seeing the transitions, being able to reverse them, I think that's going to be the preventive medicine of the 21st century. We had lots of difficulty in the pioneers. Everyone had multiple difficulties, multiple actionable opportunities, and we reversed a lot of these things, even in the period of a single year. Vitamin D, 90 out of 108 were low. There are 6 variants from 3 genes at least, and I'm sure there are more. If you had multiple of those things, you needed megadoses of vitamin D to be changed, and they're almost certainly unknown blocking variants. So you need the combination of genetics and clinical chemistries to be able to actually call what you want to do to improve the levels of vitamin D and so forth. So the patients were delighted they could take control of their own health. They felt that your genetics weren't your final destiny, but rather just your potential, and things could be circumvented. But most important, most of the pioneers really, I think, would fall right near the bottom of stairways that goes up to optimal wellness and so forth. You can elevate yourself up the stairs with actionable possibilities, which increase enormously as the amount of data are generated increases. And what we want to do is move people up to the elderly of Eric Topol individuals, 80s and 90s, perfectly healthy, never a disease, no drugs, and go into the 90s mentally and physically alert. And we think we can do that with the actionable possibilities here. But what it means is that it's a lifetime journey. And by that, we mean from the inception all the way through to the end. Aravale, as I told you, was the company we created to do this. And I just show you this to show the scaling that we think we can get by 2020, and we'll be in a unique position to look at wellness to disease transitions. And ISB has a unique relationship in helping Aravale analyze the data and so forth. So the affiliation with Providence gave us the chance to think about initiating a whole series of translational pillars. Providence has 50 hospitals. It's in 7 states. It's a $20 billion operation. It has 30 million electronic patient records. It sees 5 million patients a year. They're an ideal partner for us because they do not have the arrogance of academic medical centers. They do not have the silos, and they don't have the same kind of skepticism. But you have to persuade them that what they're going to do is useful. We've created a series of translational pillars. We have funding to do 2 of them. And in all cases, we're going to use 1 or more of these systems-driven technologies and strategies, and always the dense, dynamic, personalized data clouds that give us new views of these possibilities. The partners are ISB, Providence, Aravale, and a company that allows us to extract indigestible clinical data records from hospitals and put the anonymized records in the cloud available for analysis and query by Jupyter workstations and so forth. Scientific wellness, Providence has agreed to put 2,000 of its programs into the Aravale program for 3 years, compare them with 2,000 controls to look, 1, at how wellness increases, and 2, the enormous economic saving, and we won't have time to talk about that. With Alzheimer's, we're taking a systems approach, multidimensional analyses. We've got 3 different clinical arms and a control arm. And what I think we'll be able to do within a 5-year period is reverse the earliest stage of Alzheimer's completely back to normal. The democratization of scientific wellness is key. It's really expensive today, and we're using middle-class, upper-middle-class people to generate the data that lets us prove the issue. But the key point is, in a 10-year period, the costs will decline from $5,000 a year to perhaps $100 a year or so. Avatars and apps are going to enormously amplify what the scientific wellness coaches can do. Scientific wellness is going to be covered by health insurance and government payers, and I think this will allow an appropriate democratization. So the future of healthcare. One, P4 has come to the healthcare system. We're doing things now that are predictive, preventive, certainly personal, and participatory. Number two, we're using the dense dynamic data clouds to assess genetics and environment for both wellness and for disease. We can optimize wellness. We can look at disease transitions, the prevention of the 21st century. Scientific wellness is going to be a lifetime journey. We're in a unique position, I think, to create a whole new sector of the healthcare system called scientific wellness. The data are going to absolutely revolutionize and cut the costs of healthcare enormously. And we're going to be able to revolutionize how all the healthcare industries actually operate. And as I said before, in the end, we'll be able to democratize healthcare for all, a concept that would have been inconceivable even 5 years or so ago. Thank you. I know I'm over.
We have time for one question, then we will have a panel discussion. So if there's, yeah.
How do you see the responsibility for the wellness? Is that the responsibility of the healthcare system, or will you have an insurance system separate, like a company? Or?
So my own view is that is one of the critical aspects of participatory medicine. I think people in the initial phases are going to take responsibility for their own wellness and can easily be convinced to do so. As the healthcare system and the payers respond, then there is a question of what kind of impact it's going to have. But I'll tell you, as an answer, I see in a 10-year future physicians that will be dealing with the wellness of 1,000 patients with 4 scientific wellness coaches, and the physician's major role will be to look at transitions and trauma and accidents and things like that. But if that is true, then you have to ask, what's the role of the hospital? I think hospitals are going to become more and more virtual in the future as we segregate the responsibility for health to the patients and to physicians and co-workers that can operate very easily of any kind of bureaucratic system and so forth. But we can debate that. Yeah.
So, similar to yesterday, Lee, you weren't here, but we had a similar panel discussion yesterday. And the idea here is that we have a group of PhD students in attendance, and they've prepared 1 or 2 questions to kind of get the ball rolling, and then we will open up for the audience if there's any more. And I know there's a lot of questions from the audience because I've had to cut it short, but we have about 20 minutes here. So I will turn to the PhD panel.
Maria Röll. I'm a PhD student in the field of immunology at Karolinska Institutet. And the question is, how can the process from research to clinical applications be simplified and faster, but still secure, basically? Yeah.
I think, Melvin, you have a unique insight into this, going from the clinic to the...
I think that's really one of the topics that we're all struggling with, especially if you look at the big paradigm shifts that we're looking at. I think that if we create really the multi-professional teams where we have the scientists at the table with the doctors that treat the patients, we're getting much closer. So that's at the working floor level. The second part is about legislation. I think that we have overcomplicated legislation a lot within Europe, within the different countries, but also within our institutions. Also, to your point, how flat can we organize ourselves in order to make fast decisions? So I think that we have to deal with it on several levels, but it has to start within the environment of the scientists and the hospitals to really push for this change, and then be helped by the governments. One of the things that I refer to in my talk is that I met the CEOs of the university hospitals in Europe last week. One of the things that we're going to do is in the next couple of months, talk to the leaders in the European Union to see how we can make the next step and can make it work within the institutions that are there and hopefully will be there in the future as well.
Yeah. So I'll give you an example of what we've done. Because I'm president of ISB and executive VP, chief science officer of Providence, I have a unique opportunity to bridge these two critical institutions. So for all the science translational pillars that I listed up there, we've put together teams that are made of people from ISB and clinician scientists from Providence. And we've spent extended periods of time debating about protocols, how we're going to do it, funding, all the other kinds of issues. And I think what we've created is a unique environment where people on both sides of the fence, the basic science side and the clinical side, have enormous mutual respect, enthusiasm, and excitement for this ability to bridge and effectively make things happen. So the first two translational pillars have been done in about 4 months, and we're essentially all done with them. We have the preliminary funding in place. They'll both be getting started in the next kind of quarter. So I think the ability to mix the people, I think the ability to have access to C-level individuals to make sure no bureaucracy gets in the way, and I think the ability to have access to funding, and that is really key. So one of the things that Providence has given me permission to do is spend an enormous amount of time fundraising from grateful, rich patients that are excited about a lot of the kind of things that we're doing. I think if you wait for government funding to get big science projects going, you'll wait forever. And the other point I'll make is when I started Scientific Wellness in 2014, I went to Francis Collins at NIH and tried to pitch him on helping us support that. And he said, NIH will never be interested in this kind of science. Of course, Obama made them interested with precision medicine a year later. That's a different point. But what we did then is we decided we're going to get it started anyway. And we went out and we raised the $2.5 million I needed to do that project from philanthropy. So we got started almost instantly.
But there is a difference between countries in that respect. I think
Absolutely.
that the arrangement in the US is very different from the arrangement in Europe. If you look at funding and if you look at governmental rules and regulations.
Yeah, yeah.
There's a lot more private funding in the US, I would imagine.
Yeah.
And a much more government funding in Europe.
Yeah.
So they each have their blessings.
Yep,
Yeah,
absolutely.
no question.
I can add a little bit to that. So when you mentioned the idea of your solution shop, Melvin, that you talked about, is there a risk that we don't have the talent actually to fill these solutions or the expertise there?
Definitely. I think that's one of the biggest worries in healthcare is how to attract and how to maintain the high level of expertise that we need. Especially in a time with a lot of economical growth and a lot of competition in the market. I think that's one of the things that really is one of the top issues at the moment in Sweden, but also in the rest of Europe. So we have to create attractive jobs. We have to have attractive tenure tracks for them, and we have to have the agile environment. Because one of the things that we both talk about a lot is it's teamwork, it's agile, and it's high performance.
Right, right.
I'll tell you, adding to that, the issue that we have enormous challenge with is the computational side of the equation.
Yeah.
And let me tell you, in computational biology, there are really two classes of citizens. 0.5% are these incredible geniuses that can invent the future on doing things. And frankly, then there are a lot of bioinformatics people that are very essential, but they aren't going to invent the future. The problem ISB has is we're dealing with Microsoft, Boeing, Amazon for these very high-level computational people. And in the blink of an eye, we've lost 3 really superb people. Their salaries double to triple from what we could ever think about paying. So all we have to say is, but the vision is a great one. Don't you want to stay here and change the world?
Right.
Rather than sell the world more goods.
Yeah.
But, you know, that if you're young, money makes a difference.
I think that one of the things that comes out of the discussions that we had yesterday and also today connected to your talk is the big gap that we need to bridge. The things that are really going on and changing incredibly fast, and the people in the healthcare environment that still work in a way that have been working for quite a while. Right. How to bridge that gap more successfully and also faster, because we have to be aware of the fact that the changes are going more rapidly than ever before.
Yeah.
I mean, the idea, or I guess one of the solutions was to use this artificial intelligence to quickly search. Well, I assume it means to quickly search through these results. And I mean, that risks becoming a black box, however, I think, that you just put in you put something in and you get out a treatment plan. And then you really wind up trusting that technology a lot.
But I think that we have to make one step before, and that's adopting that possibility, that we can have that as decision support. So to your point, I think that it should not lead the decision, but it should be decision support. Yeah. But I think that if you referring to the question that Jan asked about leadership, I think that leadership at the moment is extremely important to show that we have different options, possibilities, and that we're changing more rapidly than ever before, and to create the environment that that's possible.
We'll take a question from the audience.
For two excellent presentations. It gives hope for the future. And as a patient with a complex chronic disease, as interested in science, actually as interested enough in science to do a doctorate in my own disease, I think it's great to hear you talk about the future in this way. I want to ask you, because there is a movement, I'm not sure if you're aware of it, among patients called We Are Not Waiting. # We Are Not Waiting, starting in type 1 diabetes. And as a patient with the Parkinson's, I think it's a wonderful thing that people can take their own disease into their own hands. And I use N-of-1 experiments for myself to optimize my treatment and the effects of my medication. But I want to ask you, as patients, what can we do to speed up this development, both from scientific side as well as the healthcare side? Because Melvin talked about how healthcare is, they don't really want to change. And scientists are also reluctant to change. So how can we work together to make this happen sooner?
Well, I can give you an example of what we do is these N-of-1 experiments can be utterly critical in learning new kinds of things. So in Aravale, we now have 1,500 patients, and about 40% of them have one or another kind of chronic disease. And what they've agreed to do is be N-of-1 patients when they go back to their physicians and in consultation with us, start trying some new kinds of experiments and so forth. So if you can find groups that are willing to explore these new kind of techniques, I think you can make invaluable contributions to them.
Sarah, to your point, I disagree with you that healthcare is unwilling to change. I think that healthcare and doctors and nurses are very willing to change. But I think that the core issue, of course, that every change increases insecurity to a level that you have to manage it. And I think that that's really one of the issues. To try to answer your question, I think that what you can do as a person with a disease, I rather prefer than calling you a patient, a person with a disease, to pull as much or push as much at the same time in the healthcare system, to put on the demands and also make your voice very clear and audible in the community. And I think that you're doing a great job in that respect. But I think that we need a lot more persons like you who from different areas voice their opinion and make it very clear what they need. One of the things that we talk a lot about is do we understand what patients need? And one of our mutual friends, Bas Bloem, he's a famous neurologist from the Netherlands who built up the Parkinson network. One of the very simple tests that he did a couple of years ago at his outpatient clinic together with the colleagues is, okay, let's list 5 points that these patients want to be solved by us, and ask the patient the same in the outpatient waiting room. and see whether that matches. Well, it very rarely matches 100%. At best, it's 3 out of 5, but most of the time it's 2 out of 5. So we need to get a much better understanding what we need to solve for our patients. So push.
Yes, Martin Berg, a PhD student at Karolinska and also a junior doctor at the Danderyds Hospital. And it was a very, very interesting morning, and particularly, of course, these future technologies are inspiring. But tying to that, and also what we saw yesterday, looking back, that, for example, the price of sequencing has gone down so much. Is it this, for example, very fast sequencing that we talk about, is it enough that we suddenly invent the machine? Or me, as being both in the lab and in the clinic, can say that in the lab it feels like I have much more opportunity already to do things. So is it just enough to get the machines? Or if not, as a group of PhD students with different backgrounds, what skills or disciplines will be needed in the future to bring these technology into the clinic?
Well, I would say we're actually starting a program with a brand new medical school in Western Washington, where we're going to set up a systems medicine, P4 medicine course with a textbook we're just finishing up. And the first 60 MD students are all going to be taking the Airvale Scientific Wellness Program for the 4 years of their duration. And in the first year, they'll learn how to analyze their own data to come to actionable possibilities and that kind of understanding. So I think the tools that you need are, one, I think you really have to understand these new systems approaches, generally about the technologies, but it's important to have a good general understanding. You know, what DNA sequencing has done is utterly revolutionized how we can make so many different kinds of measurements in biology and disease that were never even conceived before. You can go pull DNA out of blood, and you can say a lot about disease just from that analysis. So thinking about how you can use these tools to improve the assays that will give you better insights in your patient, I think is a really interesting opportunity for bright young students in the future. But it means you need a core background in technology, a core background in the general computational tools and things like that. But with that, I think the sky's the limit in the kind of thing you can do. And you just have to decide how much of your time you're going to be a physician, how much of your time you're going to be a researcher, and how much you want to be in the frontier of researching. Those are all really exciting options.
I think one thing that I would like to add is you will probably be a doctor up to 2050 or 2060. Now, we are predicting the future now, and it's hard to predict the future for the next 5 to 10 years because it's going to be so much change in that period. We know that at least 85% of all the predictions are wrong. So I think that the core thing that you need to have in mind is that you need to be flexible. You need to be extremely flexible in the way you approach your work and the way what's going to be your job in the next coming 10, 20 or 30 years. And then getting a light understanding of the things that are going on is extremely important. And it also prompts us to rethink the curricula that we have been building in universities. I think that that's really the next step that we have to make.
I would like to add on to that question a bit, and then we'll take one more after this. But when Lee, you talk about a person being surrounded by billions of data points of their information, and I understand that that's their metabolome, their proteome, their genome at all times. And it would be wonderful to be able to look at that data and see the patterns that signal onset of disease. But do we risk then, do we risk making it really binary in a way, where I imagine that I'm in my house and I have a green light on that says my wellness is good right now, and then the light turns yellow and I panic, right? But I don't really know why. All of that data is being transmitted to the receiver in some way, and the algorithm is telling me that something is wrong, but it makes me just nervous all the time. Do you see what I mean? Can we handle all this information?
All of these informations take away the digital nature of most decisions. I mean, there is no boundary between wellness and disease. It's absolutely a continuum, and what these data clouds let you do is ascertain where you are on that continuum. And we're now actually getting objective measurements where we can quantify wellness. I'd say in 2 or 3 years, we'll be able to have a standard that's really going to let us know how far you are along that wellness potential that you have. And that's going to be essential for a lot of what we do. So, but it's a continuum. It is. Okay. These aren't digital choices ever.
So Ulf Johnson again from MSD. I'm very, very interested in hearing your opinion. When you say that healthcare would be more health and less care, not just fighting unhealth, waiting for patients to come to the hospital and we cure them, but rather to see that they don't get to the door in the first place. Do you see that it will be a little bit like the dentist, that you will routinely come once a year and you will go through your data and give advice on how to behave or the best options you have for the future, or to see it in the other way around? Would that be a change you see if you look into the future?
So the simple answer is yes. But how often you'd get data to kind of check up on yourself would be a function of your age. So when you're young, all of us felt we were immortal. We were never, ever going to change. And you're probably maximally healthy. But when you move into middle age and later, then these transitions start coming in, and you certainly want to be able to follow those. My guess is, what I think is going to happen within 10 years is that we'll have a lot of the measurements we're talking about for scientific wellness move right to the home. I can see having a tricorder that is able to prick your thumb, take a drop of blood, and make 5,000 key measurements, and then transmit that to an analytics center, and it can process it. So you could do that once a week or once a month or once every 3. You could do it according to what made sense and where your transitions were at that point in time. So I think it would be entirely dependent on the patient and the transitions they're going through and so forth. And I think it would increase as you got older. You'd want to keep a little closer track of what kind of changes you're undergoing.
I think that the two very important trends that we are discussing, however we will end up, because we don't know really at the moment. But I think one trend is that in healthcare, we need to focus much more on wellness. And wellness was not a word that you should use in healthcare a couple of years ago.
Yep.
It was, wellness is for someone in Östermalm that wants to go to Stureplan. but not for a hospital, not for a university hospital. So that's really a big change. I think that's where we need to focus on. The other thing that we talked a little bit about, I think that, Sarah, you brought it up about the virtual hospitals. So how's the hospital landscape going to change in the next 10 to 15 years? Will there be a need of NKS? I think yes. But will there be a need of a lot of other hospitals that are now servicing a different level of care? Probably not. Yep. So we will move out a lot of patients to their home so that they can take care of their own disease or manage their own disease. And then you need some very high-end consolidated environments like a university hospital or a very specialized hospital.
Yeah. I want to emphasize your point. When we started this program in 2014, we had an enormous debate as to whether wellness was a legitimate word because so much phony wellness exists, okay? And that's why we inserted scientific, which really means quantitative. And that differentiates it from a lot of the shyster-type wellness. But I think wellness does capture exactly what we want to do for people. We want to optimize their wellness at every stage of their life to the greatest extent that we can. And they will have to participate actively in this process because it requires acting upon your actionable possibilities. And that, in some cases, means major lifestyle changes. And that's why I think the scientific wellness coaches are going to become a whole new sector of the healthcare industry. And frankly, as a young person, I think that job is an incredibly exciting kind of job because you need to learn all of these things, but you're right at the heart of the intersection between patient and the healthcare system.
Last question, Matthias.
Is this on? Yeah. Thank you, both of you, for fantastic talks. So I guess my question is to Lee. And the background for that is that we have probably about 40,000 publications with biomarker in the abstract every year. But we have very few clinical applications coming out of it, actually. And of course, this has been a really challenge for all of us in this field that we are not translating what we're finding in basic academic research into translational reality. What is your feeling? And I guess I'm working a lot in the cancer field, and we are getting a lot of what we call prognostic markers, which give you sort of statistics, but it doesn't really mean that much for a physician or the actual individual.
Right.
And we sort of want to move into predictive markers. What is your feeling? Is there a paradigm shift now when we suddenly will go from these rather, what I would say, a little bit unclear markers into something that would be really beneficial for the patients? It's a kind of leading question.
Yeah.
Okay, that's a great question, as you know. We think we really have solved the whole problem of how you create effective biomarkers if you can pose the clinical question properly. So let me give you two examples. The last two we've really pushed where we've really been successful. So one was in the US, there are 3 million nodules in the lung each year where the pulmonary oncologist has to make a decision about what to do. 600,000 of those go to surgery, and at least in the US, way more than half of the surgeries are done on benign nodules. So without going into any technical details, except to say we use targeted mass spectrometry, we were able to get a panel of biomarkers that basically had the ability at the 95% level to call more than 50% of the benign nodules accurately. So this meant they could be set aside. They wouldn't be sent to surgery. And if you do the calculations, that saves the American healthcare system more than $4 billion a year. So that panel of markers was really easy for the company we did this with, Integrated Diagnostics, to get an approved clinical trial. Insurance companies were paying for it. A second, more recent one that we've done that is equally exciting is we now have a panel of 2 protein biomarkers that has the ability of 19 weeks of gestation to make a very accurate call on whether the woman is likely to go on to preterm birth or not. If she is, that's plenty of time to give progesterone to lay the pregnancy and ensure that the infant is not a preterm infant. And preterm infants cost society unbelievable amounts of money. We now have actually 2 protein markers that do, and this is just discovery. We've done validation in the other 2. We haven't done validation in this one. We took 55 vets from Afghanistan that came back normal and compared them against 55 that had severe PTSD beautifully high, 95% level ability to distinguish these things. And what is exciting about that is this is the first disease heretofore only diagnosed psychologically that we can analyze quantitatively with blood samples now. So I think if the questions are posed right, I think we can really begin getting biomarkers. But I think a lot of people go into the biomarker business with kind of a vague, fuzzy end in sight and everything, and you end up getting vague and fuzzy answers with those.
Melvin, do you have a comment on biomarkers at the end here?
Don't start me.
Yeah.
No, but I think it's a very relevant question because we are overwhelmed by the amount of biomarkers and you don't see a lot of clinical applications to it. I think it's probably, to your point, it's a combination of multiple biomarkers that will make a difference.
It's always panels.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
And then we have to have more knowledge about the clinical question. And that comes back to an earlier discussion. So how can we connect basic research as close as possible to clinicians to make it work? Yep. Because that's where the answer lies.
Yeah. And we spend a lot of time with clinicians honing both of those questions, you know. So the partnership is really essential.
Yeah, it's essential.
Very good. I think we should thank the speakers once more for a great discussion.